On Life and Meaning is brought to you by Blumenthal Performing Arts, celebrating its 25th year presenting the best in the performing arts, sharing and employing the arts as a major catalyst to strengthen education, building community cohesiveness, and advancing economic growth. Further support is provided by Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library, one of America's leading urban public libraries, delivering exceptional services and programs with a mission to improve lives and build a stronger community. And by the Arts and Science Council, Charlotte-Mecklenburg's resource hub and lead advocate for the regional cultural community, providing culture for all.
I think that shame is similar to what I experience. And what we all have to do is recognize within that shame, there's a lot of power. And if we're able to transition that shame into power and recognize that I shouldn't feel guilty or feel bad for being a black kid with money back then, I can do something to help improve my life and your life, then I can use that power to improve everyone. I mean, listen, having that position, having that privilege also gives you the chance to lead, to do things that take us into a direction that we all really want to go. The shame was associated with, I just never felt like one of the group. And I hated that until I learned to stand alone and realize that's what I'm called to do.
Toussaint Romain is a former assistant public defender in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Public Defender's Office, where he most recently represented indigent clients charged as habitual felons. He is also an adjunct professor teaching courses on criminal justice and criminology at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He has received numerous honors and awards, including the Nish Jamgotch Jr. Humanitarian Award for exceptional service to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg community, the Charlottemagazine Charlottean of the Year Award, and the Leadership Charlotte Schley Lyons Circle of Excellence Award. In this episode, we discuss running to become District Attorney of Charlotte-Mecklenburg, the man in the white shirt, privilege and wealth, and devotion to making his community better. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. Toussaint, welcome.
Thanks. Love to be here.
We're going to start with some breaking news. This afternoon, you are announcing that you are running for Mecklenburg County District Attorney. Why?
Yeah, that's right. Humbled to make the announcement and make this move for three reasons, I would say. One is to really provide safety to our community. I think fairness is also another part of this, and reform. Ultimately, with safety, I live in West Charlotte. My 85-year-old neighbor, Grandma White, is afraid to come out of her home. My other neighbor on the other side of my house is a 90-year-old man who doesn't sleep at home. He goes to his daughter's house and sleeps on the couch because he's afraid of the neighbors next to him on the other side. These are my neighbors, and they're trapped in their home or out of their home because of issues of safety. A couple days ago, my daughter heard a man crying. He said, "Daddy, someone's crying." So I came outside and walked and saw a man laying in the street. Walked over to him, Mark, and he was bleeding on the side of his face. Called 911, attended to him. Come to find out he had been pistol whipped by someone else. So this is a young black man who had been pistol whipped by another young black man in my neighborhood. This violent crime and this issue of safety is huge for me. I want to do something about that. I think fairness is also important. We need to address violent crime, but we also need to address mental health issues and substance abuse. I think there are more people in our jails and prisons with mental health issues and drug addictions than there are those who are committing violent crimes. And that's lopsided. That's not where we should be as a community. And so if we can do programs and host things that help us address substance abuse and drug addiction in a way that's fair, then we won't create more criminals. I've had a chance to fly to Seattle, fly to Chicago, and talk to prosecutors around the nation about programs they're doing and how they're doing them and what works and what doesn't work. And that kind of reform, that kind of fairness, and that kind of safety is something our community needs. And I would also say the person that's currently in the office or the position has taken a tough on crime approach. That's the same approach that we've had for the past 8 years and really for the past maybe 3 decades. And it doesn't work. I want to make a change in a way that helps our community get better. The community is crying for it. They're ready for it. With the task force report and the stuff I've studied and learned from them, there's resources and there's an infrastructure in place to help navigate this change and usher in a new sense of change. And so I feel obligated, my friend, at this point to say, hey, leadership is either an opportunity or an obligation. And I feel like my experience in life has provided me with this obligation to step up, to do something, and to do something that betters all of us as a community. So that's why.
You're an assistant public defender, or you have been.
Yes.
Why should an assistant public defender become the chief prosecutor of Mecklenburg County?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, some folks ask, Toussaint, how could you go to the other side? And my response to them is, you know what? At the end of the day, there's only one side. It's the side of justice. Let's do what's fair. Let's do what's right. Tough on crime approach creates more criminals. Because if we're convicting everyone because we're tough on crime, that means there are more folks with convictions, with records, and unable to go back to work or to live in certain places. And I'm talking about with misdemeanors. And so if we can take different approaches and learn about individuals and step in their shoes. There's a DA out on the West Coast that has a step into their shoes type of prosecution approach. And that is, let's figure out why they're committing crime. Is it drug addiction? Is it substance abuse? Are they really a bad, violent person? Or was it some kids having a joyride and just happened to get caught? Let's step into their shoes and figure out what they're doing and then respond to crime in a way that's fair and that makes the most sense. I would say, Mark, my 10 years of being a public defender has given me a real idea of what is happening with individuals. But there are 85 prosecutors in that office that would continue to hold people personally accountable and prosecute. I would be coming in through the idea of system accountability and saying, hey, listen, all right, 85 folks, you do what you got to do, prosecute, but let's step into their shoes. Let's recognize that misdemeanors matter. So if this is a kid that just happened to steal a pack of bubble gum because he was just being a kid, well, let's not throw the book at him and prosecute him and give him a record or a conviction. Let's help use this as a teachable moment to put him back on the right track so that he's not in the system, but he's able to help us as a community. And so I think those thoughts, that experience I've had, but I've been in I've been in the criminal justice system for 22 years. I started off as a student at UNC Charlotte taking criminal justice and have worked with police, law enforcement. I'm currently in an FBI Citizens Academy, worked for federal prosecutors, worked for judges, traveled overseas at the European Court for Human Rights, and have worked in this system for 22 years, and I'm a college professor at UNC Charlotte teaching about criminal justice for the past 8 years. And so I believe my unique perspective and approach would help create a system, again, that's safe, that's fair, and I think brings, right and system reform, ultimately in a way that creates public safety.
You've been consistently on the record that you had no interest in public office. What changed?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I loved being a public defender. I loved, working with my clients and also being able to work in the community. For instance, I was working with Carolina Panthers, and this was just discussion. Nothing was on paper. But we were going to create an expungement to employment seminar, to where the Panthers were willing to create and allow me to come in and bring expunctions, really removing people's records or whatever the case is for those that are eligible for it. And then the Panthers would use their network to bring in vendors or employers to hire these folks on the scene, on the spot. I was able to do things like that over and over again, where I didn't need to run for public office, right? I was getting stuff done. I'm still getting stuff done. But Ramona Brandt, who was a woman who was offered clemency from President Obama and was released from prison, she and I were working together to do several things. And then she died suddenly on a Sunday. And she left this huge void of things that needed to get done. But she always said, I was the woman that got out. I was the one who was released from prison. So many of my sisters were not. I'm obligated to answer their cry. And I'm just hearing from folks from Republicans, from Democrats, conservatives, liberals, from moms who have had their young sons shot, killed, or in the system, saying this criminal justice system is broken. You know it, Toussaint, and I know it. So stop running from what you can do to make it better. So that's ultimately why I decided to run. The good part of my running so far is it's pushed the other candidate, the other side, to create more of a campaign that addresses the community. That's community safety. That's dealing with second chances. That's dealing with other things. Before it was just purely tough on crime. So I think, initially jumping into this, it's pushing the conversation forward, but I don't believe that other side is going far enough and to really help bring the change we need in our community to make us safer. So I jumped in to help get there.
You resigned from the public defender's office.
That's right.
And you are running full-time?
That's right. So I'm currently unemployed, but it's a risk that my wife and I discussed, and I don't make much as a public defender, but saved all I could to be able to make this run again, because I really believe that change is possible. I really believe that reform here is possible. I really need my 85-year-old neighbor and my 90-year-old neighbor to feel safe in their community. And I believe now is a time for me to make that change. So I decided to do it.
Toussaint, there's so much to talk about, but I'd like to take a step back and provide a frame for those who are listening. You had a defining moment for you personally and for the city of Charlotte in September 2016 that has since raised your profile in Charlotte and nationally. What was that moment?
Yeah, so I believe it was probably September 2016 during the shooting of Keith Lamont Scott. Community and the police, which is, I guess, still part of the community, seemed to be at odds, right? And I just stood in between these two groups, just demanding that both sides just do it the right way. Just trying to save lives, trying to make sure that we remained safe. If it was a risk to me, then so be it. But Mark, I have to go back, though, to 1992. As a little boy growing up, I remember in Southern California, I remember watching the Rodney King verdict. My grandmother was in the room, and she was born in 1915. I feel like she lived with me forever. She was an amazing woman. But she was the matriarch of my family, and she was crying insuppressibly when the verdict came down. I'm not sure if you've ever seen the most strongest woman you know cry, but as a little boy, it was very daunting. My mother was upset. My eldest sister was really bothered. And then I had another sister at UCLA at the time who was trapped in her dorm. And here I am, a little young teenage boy, not even that, watching this, and I felt just so trapped, like I couldn't do anything to protect the women I love the most. And I just wanted to yell, stop, right? Just stop, everybody, stop. I could see the hurt and the pain. But then 1999 came along, and Amadou Diallo was a African-American male, immigrant male in the Bronx, and he was shot 41 times. And I was living in New York at the time for high school and traveling back and forth. And I was out there then. Again, just saying to folks, do this the right way. Stop. Let's be safe, be angry, be mad, but do it the right way. Then in 2006, I was in Germany. I was studying abroad, European Court for Human Rights. And I went to Dachau, which was a concentration camp, and an eerie, very surreal place if you've ever been. Afterwards, after walking on those rocks and going into the chambers and seeing fingernail scratches on the wall, after that tour, we went back to Munich. And in Munich, there were neo-Nazis marching down the street with signs protesting. And then there were other German folks on the other side, standing against them. And here I am, like the darkest spot, all jokes aside, standing in between these two groups, just saying, stop, or whatever I was trying to say, alto, whatever, just stop, do this the right way. Then fast forward, Mark, to 2015, when Jonathan Ferrell was shot and killed. There was a verdict that returned a hung jury, or a no verdict that was a hung jury verdict. And 30 protesters took to the streets. And there was a quick standoff, and I walked in between those 30 protesters and police for the next 11 hours. Again, just keeping the peace. So then, following 2015, a year later in 2016, we found ourselves with Keith Lamont Scott. And so I was out there just doing what I had been doing the 5 or 6 previous times. But again, I was that little boy in my living room with my grandmother, just saying, stop. do this the right way. There's hurt on both sides. There's anger on both sides. Let's do this the right way so that we're a safer community, and I don't want anybody to get hurt.
Well, this time CNN was watching.
Yeah.
And there were cameras following everyone on the streets, and you became known as the man in the white shirt who was in between the police lines and the protesters. Take me through that day. You went to work that day.
I did. Yeah, great. So if I can start the night before, Tuesday night, which was the actual shooting, I was at UNC Charlotte teaching my class. The shooting happened near UNCC, and I parked a block away from where the shooting occurred. So I went to my class, taught my class, afterwards went to the gym, worked out. On my way back to my car, heard of the protests and the standoff, went out there, and in my tank top, just stood in between the lines again, right? Hold the peace. And, I ended up getting maced that night, got gassed with everyone else that night, got on my knees at one point, put my hands up and was just praying and just trying to keep the peace. And that's when I met Braxton Winston, who's now a city council member, and really just tried to keep the peace. And Mark, I was out there till about 4 or 5 in the morning. Left, went home, took a shower, which was a bad idea if you ever have mace on you. It burns even more. But got up the next day and it was at my office at 8 o'clock. Went to work, had cases I had to handle. So I'm in my suit because, that's what we wear to court. Went through the day with handling my cases. Then afterwards, there was a prayer vigil at the Hal Marshall Park, which is seminal to these kind of movements. So I went there after work with several of my coworkers, prayed for a little bit, then as a community, and then some folks took their march uptown, 4 or 5 blocks up the street. And I was talking to a sheriff, and then these 2 just community guys walked up to us and said, "Hey man, pray, let's keep the community safe, let's do our part." And so we ended up walking towards the uptown area, and chaos was beginning to let loose. There was breaking into some stores, in particular at the Spectrum Center. There, a man had just been shot and was in critical condition, and riot gear officers took their form and lined up, protesters on the other side, and I just walked up to the front and saw what was happening. And again, that little boy in his living room with his grandmother just wanting to say stop, and just stood in between both sides. The police, began to give commands to disperse. They started to shoot tear gas and mace and other things. And, fortunately, Mark, there was one point, it was amazing to me, at least looking back, to where there was tear gas, a cloud of tear gas that had basically consumed maybe half of a block. And protesters were running. Officers had their riot gear helmets on, their gas masks, and they were shooting gas continually. And I was walking through this cloud of smoke, and I was grabbing protesters and folks and saying, "Hey, back up." And it was amazing. I could touch their shoulder and say, "Dude, relax, back up. I don't want you to get hurt." And they would say, "Okay, thanks." And they would turn around and go the other way. It was amazing to me. And about 5-10 minutes of being in this cloud, I got choked up. I couldn't breathe anymore. So I kind of jogged over to the side of a wall and took a knee and tried to catch my breath. But I was in this cloud of tear gas and smoke for 10 minutes nearly, I felt like. Or may not have been that long. It may have been 10 seconds, but it felt like forever. And I was able to just to keep the peace between the two. I'll tell you, Mark, and there were a number of police officers that stopped me and gave me a hug. I said, "Toussaint, thank you for being out here. Toussaint, you're saving our lives too, man. Don't, I don't want you to not realize that." I mean, they were really appreciative of what we had been doing. And so, all things considered, the community as a result, I think, benefited from that one act. There was a later interview with CNN where they were, trying to make it a horror story, but I made it a cry for help and for leaders to show up. And Mark, the very next day, it was amazing to see a host of people from clergy and community leaders just coming and showing up. And it changed the whole tenor of the entire environment. The next 2 weeks, it felt like, which was, we were out there walking, that changed. There were no more riot gear officers. There were cops on bikes and shorts and t-shirt or short sleeve shirts, riding around with the kids. And so it was a really good moment, a critical moment. But my wife said to me the best when I got home. Well, first she said, come in, close the door. Don't forget you have a wife and kids. But she said, tonight was no different than any other night in your life. It just so happened that CNN caught it on film.
What do you think might have happened that first night if you were not the man in the white shirt?
Yeah, it's a loaded question, and I'm hesitant to answer it because I don't want it to seem like I was the savior or I was the linchpin to change the everything of that moment. I want to hope, Mark, that someone else would have stepped up. I want to hope that someone else would have saw an opportunity or felt obligated to make that difference and to be that change, to lead. But I do know there were a number of people who were getting hurt. Officers, had some rocks thrown at them and had some injuries, minor injuries, but injuries nonetheless. There were other people who didn't have right gear on, and they were being shot and arrested and taken to the ground and slammed and jumped on and scraped across the ground. And so there are people that were being injured and people that were suffering from these injuries. But not just that, Mark, there was also the psychological harm that was done. I mean, as a community, there were people that were terrified. I don't want to expose where you live, but there was a man in this neighborhood. He sent me an email saying, Toussaint, I'm sitting in my living room. My daughter's upstairs and I'm watching what's happening on TV. I hear the sirens right outside my window, helicopters, and I'm terrified. And I'm wanting to grab my daughter and put her in the car and drive away as far as we can to safety. But then I saw you on TV. I saw you on that white shirt and I sat down and just said, man, what's this guy doing? But man, he's making the difference and he's really helping out. And I think that there was a psychology for so many of us that were suffering from this harm, this fear, this danger, this how could this happen in Charlotte moment. And so being out there, I think really helped all of us find some peace, some harmony, some ways of answering the cry in our own ways. But again, I hope that if I hadn't been out there, maybe you would have been, or someone would have been out there just to fill that gap.
When danger breaks out, most people run away. A few people run toward danger. An even less number of people put themselves in the middle of the fray and become part of the story. You did talk about these previous instances in your life.
Yeah.
What draws you in?
So, Mark, I don't think about the pain. I don't think about the danger or the fear. If I can be quite honest with you, I never thought about losing my life, which could have been around any corner. If I can share quickly, I remember going home that Wednesday night, knowing my wife wanted to have the talk because my phone died. So she was trying to reach me. Her friends called her and woke her up saying, oh my God, your husband's on CNN. So she turns the TV on and sees what's happening. And of course, we didn't prearrange this thing happening or pre-discuss it. So I get home, I sit in my driveway for a minute and I'm realizing, man, I could have died tonight. Go into my house, go into my children's bedroom. And I sit alongside their bed and I'm just like, man, I may not have made it home. And so there was this sense only at that moment of fear and of me possibly losing my life. During the time when I was out there, again, I felt obligated. I felt like it was the right thing that needed to happen and I needed to do it. And it's because of who I've had a chance to live with and grow with and learn from growing up. Julian Bond, who marched with Dr. King, was my mentor in law school. He said, Toussaint, look, I just got out there and did what the right thing. I did what was right at the time that needed to happen. I had a chance, Mark, to live with Rosa Parks for a week and day to day, wherever she went, and having a chance to kind of see and be exposed to what she was experiencing, but also hear her story in, the unfiltered way was pretty amazing. I was at a dinner with Barack Obama and had a conversation with him, Senator Obama at the time. I was clerking for a judge in Chicago. Johnny Cochran and Nancy Brinker and the sons of the Brown versus Board of Education. I mean, I can go through the list of so many people in my life Shirley Chisholm, who was the first African-American woman to run for president from Brooklyn. She used to use my dad's ballroom as her headquarters. I've met people who sacrificed because they wanted to see a better, more improved community. And many of them suffered all you can imagine, and very few of them suffered death. But in the big scheme of things, they also had a huge impact on change. Their legacy will forever remain. And I didn't do it to have a legacy. I didn't do it to have an impact so that people could remember Toussaint Romain. But I've been amazed to see the number of folks who've benefited and who have accepted leadership opportunities, who are doing things to change our community. I feel like, Mark, it's like I've helped the water rise for our whole community, which means every ship has also risen as well. And, I like that idea of helping improve my community.
Toussaint, since that moment, you have been interviewed by national reporters. Mm-hmm. You've been on television and the radio. You were part of panel discussions and new initiatives in the city. You have your own column in the newspaper. You have your own Wikipedia page. And now you're running for office. What's your message?
So my message is simple, I think, to the people. It's this idea of leader. And the four most important letters of that word are L-E-A-D. Because it's not about me, the noun, but it's about me, the verb. It's not about me, the leader, but it's about me leading. It's not about me, some person with a title, but what am I doing? What am I doing to improve the community? What am I doing to help others? What am I doing? And so, Mark, if I can L-E-A-D, then that E-R connects me to my ship. This idea of leadership. If I do something, it will connect me to certain results. If I do good, I'll have good results. And in essence, my L-E-A-Ding, the E-R connects me to my ship that leaves port carrying precious cargo that's able to go around the world improving those and helping those who need it. And so my cry has always been, get up, lead. And I've done that in one or two ways. Ultimately, I want to provoke people to action. Sadly, it means I also provoke people to anger. I don't like that guy or what he's saying. But fortunately, that's been not as many folks have responded that way. Many people have been provoked to action, provoked to L-E-A-D in their own way. And I think that's what we need. If we all come together and do our own individual part, we can make our community stronger.
What is the actual change you want to see?
So, Mark, you and I are sitting down together having a conversation. We're talking. We're sharing. We're enlightening each other. We're sharing a moment. Your listeners will have a chance to hear this and will have a chance to embrace a moment. Ultimately, I think they'll be able to say, you know what? I can do something. And what is it that's most important to me? How can I L-E-A-D? What can I do? Literacy is really important to me, a listener might say. So let me volunteer at the library or imagine on reading to kids. I mean, that goes a long way. It also increases our literacy rates for our young people, which improves their ability to have upward mobility, which means those folks are contributing members of society, which means, right, that cycle improves. I'm not trying to change just a moment for sake of change. I want to change for sake of really creating a whole new world. Chinese proverb says, one flap from a butterfly's wing can cause a hurricane around the world. What if we could be that butterfly flap? And what if you flap and I flap and your listeners all flapped? We wouldn't just create a hurricane. We would create a tsunami. And that tsunami of change could create the improvements we all want. Listen, there's a quality of life we all share. Everyone wants better schools. Everyone wants better homes and safer neighborhoods. Everyone wants livable wages and jobs that they're able to work for. Everyone wants to have a chance to go out and enjoy each other. Everyone wants the same quality of life, or at least a quality of life that's improving. We're continuing to improve as a generation, and I want us to become more intentional about that and more community-minded with that. We're a common unity. Common unity. And those two words together are community. So what if we had a common unity in essence of creating quality of life that impacts us not just today, but for a legacy and for a lifetime and for next generations to come? Let's be that tsunami.
Toussaint, I'd like to talk about you and how you came to be the person that you are and what informs your passions. I'd like to start with your name, Touissant Romain. Is there a story behind it?
Yeah, so Toussaint, my parents are from the islands, from the Caribbean. My dad's from Dominica. My mother's from Barbados. And Toussaint is a popular island name. There was a man named Toussaint Louverture who was a Haitian slave who learned how to read and write and then defeated Napoleon Bonaparte in a war, liberating Haiti from slavery. So Toussaint is a huge revolutionary name down in the islands. And so when I was born, my mother wanted to give me that name. A lot to live up to, but that's the name Toussaint and where it comes from. And so I'm honored to have that name. I'm honored to feel like I am, wanting to liberate our community in ways that are fair and safe and that help all of us maintain, a quality of life that's good.
I understand you grew up in two places at once.
I did. My parents got divorced when I was born, and my mother moved from Brooklyn, New York, where I was born, to San Diego, California. So northern San Diego, where I grew up. So I was flying back and forth between mom and dad. Holidays, I had to choose where I wanted to go. But as a young boy, I wanted to really live with my dad. And so for high school, I went back to New York City, and he put me in an all-boys private boarding school, which wasn't what I was expecting. I was expecting to live with dad, right? But he put me in a boarding school, which I'm forever grateful for. It was one of the top-tier all-boys schools in the nation. Was able to learn and gain and develop a lot. And it really created within me this structure of how to work hard, how to put effort into anything, and how to become a really good student. And that helped me throughout life, I would say. Effort inevitably yields achievement is what we would learn. So just keep working hard, and that will yield some achievement. And so that was me back and forth, though. And then came down south for college.
What was the boarding school?
The boarding school was Trinity Pauling, which is in Pauling, New York, by Poughkeepsie, Danbury, that area. So just an hour from the city by train or so. So it was a great school.
You're a boarding school kid.
I am. But more importantly, I'm a West Indian kid, right? When it comes to to education, you don't mess with education. Like that's the biggest thing you don't want to, mess up in. So we all took education very seriously.
How did being a bi-coastal child of divorced parents who went to a boarding school shape you?
That's a really interesting question. And I had this realization a few months ago. I never fit in anywhere. So as a West Coast kid, had the Valley Talk and whatever the Valley Talk was, I can't do it now. When I would go to New York, right, they're like, dude, why you talk like that, right? You sound funny. But then when I was in California, I was the New York kid and I didn't really fit. You're too tough or whatever. Like I wasn't tough at all. Being at a boarding school and my father had resources. So I was there because of that. I wasn't a scholarship kid as some other black kids were. And so I didn't really fit in there, but I was a black kid at a predominantly white school. So I felt like I didn't fit in there either. And I was just always trying to find my place, trying to find where I fit in. And then I'm just a unique guy. I mean, I read 3 books a month. I like to have deep esoteric conversations on things. And, I'm a thinker in those ways. And so I just never found my place. Made me feel like I was a loner. I struggled with that to some degree, but always, not having a real place to fit in made me realize that I fit in everywhere and I could maneuver and work with anyone, although I may not have felt like I was part of that group. So to connect this to the 2016 demonstrations, protests, riots, whatever we might call it, it's funny, on one side were the police, the other side were the community members, protesters, I guess. The protesters, and I had my foot, like if you can imagine an imaginary line down the center, I had one foot over by the side of the police, one foot on the other side of the line, the protesters. The protesters were saying, man, you're with the cops, because of my foot that was next to the police. The police were saying, man, you're one of the protesters, get out of here, because of my foot on that other side. And so I didn't really have a side, some might say, during that particular experience. But I was with the rest of the community who was really on that imaginary line with me in the middle, saying, we're all in this together. So I think my growing up experience taught me how to maneuver and be comfortable being alone, standing in the middle, and maybe not having a side to join, or recognizing that maybe I'm that piece that connects both sides together. I want to think I connect the East Coast and the West Coast together, right? I was able to connect members of my community at my high school together. I was president of the Black Student Union. So we had events where the rest of the school was coming in and being involved in Black cultural activities, right? And, there was a bond that was made there between 2 different parts of the community. So I think that's what I've come to accept and acknowledge about my experience. is that I'm able to connect some dots. And although I may not feel like I am one dot or the other, I'm that string, and I'm okay being that string.
Going to boarding school also suggests a background of privilege.
Yes.
What have you learned from that background of privilege?
Yeah. So leadership for me is an obligation. I was given opportunities in life, Mark, that, I know a lot of folks who look like me may not have experienced, or just a lot of folks who don't look like me may have not experienced. It's a path or access to just everything you could imagine in life. I remember in high school, we would have trips to South America, just a group of high school kids going down there to hang out and volunteer and work. Or I was able to go to, this is one level of privilege that I'm not ashamed to admit anymore, but we would go to Broadway shows once a month or many times a month. And being in New York City, going to Broadway shows, we saw all the major shows. It's where I fell in love with the opera, and where I go into the courtroom like, doing this demonstration in front of a jury. I learned and appreciated and gained that love from going to these Broadway shows. So there was a level of access to opportunities that I had that I realized a lot of other folks didn't. It was primarily by virtue of my father's hard work, but my father came off the banana boat straight from a dirt village and came to Brooklyn and just worked really hard to create businesses and opportunities. So I knew it was through a lot of hard work, and that I never took for granted. So I think what I've been doing is working really hard, like my father, to help people in a way that improves our community. So again, it's an obligation for me, and I accept that readily and willingly. But I recognize that I have a chance to help people, and I'm using my privilege to do that.
Toussaint, I want to tease out two things from what you said. First, you connected the word shame to privilege. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. So before I give my particular feelings about it, there was an example that comes to mind. And there was a family in California called the Hearst Corporation. We have a Hearst building here in Charlotte named after the same family, I believe. And there was a father who was very prominent in producing Hollywood movies. And a very rich family, had their own private jets, their own private castle, Hearst Castle on the coast of California, which I've been to. And at one point, the daughter and several friends went and robbed a bank. And there was this rejection by her of all that her family stood for. There's a very, again, similar experience here in Charlotte. I don't necessarily do name dropping, but there's a very prominent man who runs an organization here in town. And his son was one of the most prominent members of the protest, right? I ended up getting arrested again, a rejection of he and his father. And sort of this shame of, I don't want to be a part of anything you're a part of. I don't think that my shame was a result of, I don't want to be a part of this system or this pretense or the Hearst experience. My shame came with, I was never accepted, I felt like, in this sense. I came from privilege, but I was still black. So when I would go to the ritzy restaurants, or when I would travel with my other privileged friends, I would get treated differently. And it was very prominent. It was very, I'll take your order, but we don't serve you kind of stuff, even in high school. Right. And so even though I had access to different and higher levels of opportunity, my race was thrown in my face more than I cared to realize, right? I was still a black kid. But as a black kid, I would go walk the streets of Brooklyn, or, go try to hang out with the other guys. And they're like, dude, what are you doing here? Like, you have on brand new shoes and a brand new polo jacket, and, sort of picked at for that. And I hated the fact that I was not accepted as a black kid because I had money. So it was sort of the shaming, I would say, that I had in this. I just want to be friends, guys. I just want to be one of you, and I just want to be accepted. I don't want to be rejected. And I think I wrestled with that. I've learned that there's this shame that many other people still experience. And the shame, I would say, for maybe white folks that I've had a chance to speak with, becomes guilt. To where there's this guilt that I feel guilty because of what I've been given in life and where I am in life. Now, I still worked hard for it, many say, and they do. But I feel guilty for having this privilege, and I feel guilty for having opportunities that I've had. I feel guilty for living where I'm able to live, or I'm even ashamed to tell people where I live or what I do. And I think that's unfortunate. And that's, I think, people that I I think that shame is similar to what I experience. And what we all have to do is recognize within that shame, there's a lot of power. And if we're able to transition that shame into power and recognize that I shouldn't feel guilty or feel bad for being a black kid with money back then, I can do something to help improve my life and your life, then I can use that power to improve everyone. I mean, listen, having that position, having that privilege also gives you the chance to lead, to do things that take us into a direction that we all really want to go. The shame was associated with, I just never felt like one of the group. And I hated that until I learned to stand alone and realize that's what I'm called to do.
The second thing I wanted to tease out was the conversation between haves and have-nots around personal agency. What is the conversation that you have with many of the people who do not have in this community? And what do you tell them about how they can overcome their circumstances?
Yeah, great question. So I would, let me add the final piece to my father's story. He ended up going to federal prison for taxes and again, having multiple businesses back in the 80s and 90s. There were some issues that with he and his accountant type stuff. So he went to prison and lost everything. So then here I come from a father who was paying for everything, right? For a high school that I went to, he paid all out of his pocket, expecting to pay for college minus what I owed. I went from a kid who had everything to a kid who had nothing. And I'm on my own now having to provide for everything. And I didn't know how to do all that. And so pulling myself up by my proverbial bootstraps has been very tough. And, it's been an experience, a learning experience along the way. And by no means am I where I would like to be. But I share that simply to say I'm still fulfilling a purpose and a passion that I have. I've married my wife and we've sacrificed for me to be that public defender so I can help improve the community and to volunteer with organizations. And so to answer your question more specifically about personal agency and speaking to folks, listen, people in the community, either with wealth or without, all want to know how to help each other. I have a morning breakfast once a month with folks like Hugh McCall, Terry Shook, superintendent of CMS has come, and there's a group of men that we all come together and we're trying to figure out how to really improve our community. Because I met Braxton Winston, brought him into the fold, introduced him to Hugh McCall, and those two took it from there. Like I'd had nothing to do with it. That's Braxton and Hugh, and Diane Chips Bailey, but they took it and they really ran with it and created some phenomenal things. Because again, there was that shared passion, that shared quality of life desire. And so what I'm learning, Mark, is that if we can, with this personal agency, recognize that we all really share the same things. There are folks who want to know, how can I make it and what opportunities do I have? Recognizing there are folks who want to provide that wealth, which is like Charlie Elberson and others. But ultimately, creating that platform for folks to come together to do it is what I think I've been able to do and create. People don't know how to make it happen. We do recognize, because of our upward mobility and our task force report and 50 of 50, that we have some issues. Folks are all clamoring around now trying to figure out what to do to help improve that and improve our community. I've been fortunate, Mark, to be in a position to just connect those dots. I want to address at least maybe an underlying assumption that people are saying, what can you do for me? And how can I make it? And I am one without wealth. So, help me. But those folks aren't just sitting around with their hand waiting for a handout. They're saying, man, just give me, open a door for me to run through so that I can go show you I can do all the work. And they're willing to do it. And it's been a really beautiful thing to see those doors opening up and people running through, and a creation of opportunities impact our community.
Toussaint, you came from wealth and means and then lost that wealth in your life. You then went to law school and you could have become a corporate attorney, a general counsel, a civil litigator, and had that wealth back in your life.
Yeah.
But you chose not to chase it. Why?
Yeah. Because wealth is fleeting. It's, at the end of the day, useless. I like to ask this question. Does my black life matter? Yeah, it matters. Will it matter in 4,000 years, though? And the answer is no. No one's going to remember Toussaint in 4,000 years. If I were to ask you to tell me someone from your own family just 200 years ago, probably couldn't do it. So I've had to change the question of life to not does my black life matter, but rather to will my impact matter? What can I do today that's going to better tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, next decade, next century, and then again, whatever 1,000 is? What can I do? What butterfly flap can I use to make that impact? Man, I stand on the shoulders of some very amazing people who there was an opportunity cost to being advocates, to being leaders, to being provocateurs, to changing the system. Many folks of that ilk didn't die wealthy or rich, but they changed the world. And I guess it goes back to me being little boy in the room with my grandmother. But in particular, as a public defender, it goes back, it harkens for me to a time when I wanted to live with my dad. Maybe I'm a little boy trying to save his dad. Or maybe I'm a little boy who recognizes what it's like to lose your dad. And so my hope is let's create a system that takes all that into consideration. Let's create a world where I could say to people, hey, you have a chance to do the right thing. You know, your kids are watching you. Or in a position to say, let's create more safety so that we're not losing lives. And I believe as a public defender, initially and now running for district attorney, being in a position to really just improving the system. Mark, if we change the system, man, that affects all of us. And let's say the average man lives to be 85. I got some time to go. I'll be able to, create and provide for my wife and kids as I need to down the road. But for now, the time is now. The sense of urgency is imminent. What can we do and what can I do with my time to really improve and make an impact for the rest of the world?
You have name recognition.
Mm-hmm.
You have street credibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You have media savvy.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine you look good and sound good in a courtroom. I imagine you tell stories that juries can understand.
Mm-hmm.
Why not have your own law firm and leverage all of what the last 2 years have been?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. And the reality is I could monetize my moment, or I could stick to making a change. And the two don't go hand in hand. If I'm going to make the change that I've committed to make, I have to be all in. Most of the work that I do behind this has been behind the scenes and has been very impactful in creating agencies, organizations, nonprofits, has been in consulting and helping people do things. I was appointed by Governor Cooper to be part of the Human Relations Commission, which deals statewide with education, justice, equity, affordable housing. So I'm working with that. I helped create nonprofit organizations here in town that deal with keeping kids off the streets. Some of your previous guests, I worked with them, again, behind the scenes, helping them create the infrastructure and creating a network to help them boost and run with their own nonprofits and their ideas. I have 20 years worth of working with folks behind the scenes to create some real community change. I'm proud to say, for instance, one of them is Studio 345, which is up here in Spirit Square. I worked with some individuals to create that. We flew to Philadelphia with Foundation for the Carolinas, Arts and Science Council, Charlotte Works, and a commissioner. We found what they were doing there, brought it back, implemented it, and we now have nearly 100% of everyone who goes through the program. And those going through are CMS kids, many of them at risk, and some kids from the courthouse who are in some juvenile delinquency issues. But they're now going through this program, and nearly 100% are finishing high school and then moving on either to military, community college, or a 4-year degree or trade school. And that's a win. That's a win for a generational aspect. That's a win across our entire community. So I could fill my coffers with some money, with your money and others' money, and do well there. But I know that in order to be a private defense attorney, my attention would have to become focused primarily on my client and addressing those needs and less on the community part. That's why I haven't done it yet. But, the appeal, and we'll see what happens in the next several months. But I did not want to monetize this moment, especially when, there was a real chance to change the community.
I understand you are a prayerful person.
Yeah.
What do you pray for?
Yeah, man, it's so interesting that you ask that. Yeah, so the prayer that I share is not my own. It's a prayer called the Foolishness Prayer by St. Francis. And the prayer, if I can read it, basically goes like this. May God bless us with discomfort for easy answers, discomfort of half-truths, discomfort at superficial relationships so that we may live deep within our hearts. May God bless us with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people so that we may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless us with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, hunger, and war, so that we may reach out our hands to comfort them and to turn their pain into joy. And finally, may God bless us with enough foolishness to believe that we can make a difference in this world, so that we can do what others claim cannot be done, to bring justice and kindness to all our children and the poor.
Thank you for your time today, Toussaint.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.
Toussaint Romain is a former assistant public defender in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Public Defender's Office. He earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in criminal justice at UNC Charlotte and a JD at Regent University School of Law. And now, a personal word. When I sat down with Toussaint, he surprised me. I had prepared to ask him questions about his work as a public defender, the clients he represented, the cases he managed, what his day looked like, what he loved about his work. Just before I turned the microphones on, Toussaint said, "I'm not a public defender anymore. I just resigned. I'm running for office to become district attorney. I'm announcing this afternoon." I did not see that coming. Toussaint had consistently been on the record of not being interested in public office. I had a scoop on my hands. I was the first person outside his inner circle to know officially that he was running for office. He had not yet sent out his first tweet about his candidacy, or had his first public gathering. I wouldn't be the one to break the news, as this podcast would broadcast a week after our conversation. And it wasn't my news to share. It was his news to declare on his own terms. But it felt good to record his first public response to why he wanted to become district attorney and what qualified him for the role. The second thought I had was I felt I was crossing suddenly into news journalism. I don't think of myself as a reporter. I just record conversations with people who interest me. Toussaint was now a guest of this podcast in the midst of a race for public office. What was my responsibility? What responsibility did I have to share this platform with his opponent? The answer is I extended an invitation to the current district attorney because I am interested in him too, as a person, less as a candidate. He said yes, and I look forward to my conversation with him. When I think of Toussaint, so many other thoughts come to mind. The many instances in his life when he stepped into the breach of public protest. His instinct to keep the peace. His having his feet on both sides of the line. What compels someone toward danger? What compels someone to risk harm to themselves for the public good? Toussaint answered these questions. He sees himself as uniquely qualified to bridge differences. He feels an obligation to lead. One event can change lives. CNN recorded him trying to stop violence between police in riot gear and protesters in a fast-moving street protest in response to the shooting of Keith Lamont Scott, an African-American citizen killed by a Charlotte-Mecklenburg police officer. Toussaint became famous that night. The man in the white shirt. Who is he? What is he doing? What is his story? News reporters and magazine writers closed in. Toussaint became a hero, a good guy in the midst of chaos. The Humanitarian Awards soon followed. Toussaint deserves the recognition. He responded to a moment of crisis with courage, but his heroism goes far beyond one night. His life is devoted to justice. He works tirelessly for his community. The sense of calling is strong in him. The question now is what happens next. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Additional support for this podcast is provided by the UNC College of Arts and Architecture, celebrating a decade of creative education in the arts and design. Thank you to our funding partners, and to my teammates, Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, art and media director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value at a level you choose. Visit us also on our website, onlifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.